Because low levels of asbestos are present in the air, water, and soil, everyone is exposed to asbestos at some time during their life. In most cases, however, people do not develop illnesses from their exposure. Asbestos-related diseases usually occur in people who work directly with the material or who, for some other reason, are exposed to it on a regular, prolonged, or substantial basis. Historically, asbestos exposure has been of greatest concern to those involved in mining and milling of the raw material, people in the construction trades, and workers engaged in manufacturing or using products containing asbestos. Secondary exposure occurred when people who did not work directly with asbestos were inadvertently exposed to fibers as a result of sharing workspaces where others handled asbestos. For example, electricians who worked in shipyards were exposed when asbestos was used to coat the ship's pipes and hulls. In addition to people who worked with asbestos either directly or indirectly, workers' families and other household contacts were also at risk in the past. Before strict industrial hygiene rules were put in place, asbestos workers went home covered in asbestos dust. Family and household members were then exposed via inhalation of the dust from workers' skin, hair, and clothing, and during laundering of contaminated work clothes. Studies have shown increased rates of asbestos-related illnesses and deaths in the household contacts of asbestos workers. Finally, asbestos was released into the air and soil around facilities such as refineries, power plants, factories, shipyards, steel mills, vermiculite mines, and building demolitions. People living around these sites were also exposed to asbestos. Currently, the people most heavily exposed to asbestos in the United States are those in construction trades, and most occupational exposures occur during repair, renovation, removal, or maintenance of asbestos that was installed years ago. An estimated 1.3 million construction workers, as well as workers in building and equipment maintenance, are potentially at risk. Historically, most asbestos was used in construction, and even today, over 60% of asbestos produced is used in this trade. Risk to these workers can be considerable if occupational safety standards are not followed. One specific group at risk of developing an asbestos-related disease are the people who were involved in rescue, recovery, and cleanup at the site of the September 11, 2001 attacks on the World Trade Center. When the World Trade Center buildings were attacked, hundreds of tons of asbestos, which had been used in the construction of the North Tower, were released into the atmosphere. First responders, firefighters, police officers, and paramedics, as well as the construction workers and volunteers who worked in the rubble at Ground Zero, are considered at greatest risk. Residents in close proximity to the World Trade Center towers and those who attended schools nearby may also be in danger of developing asbestos-related illnesses. Over 2/3 of the World Trade Center rescue and recovery workers experienced new or worsened respiratory symptoms while working at the World Trade Center site. The World Trade Center Worker and Volunteer Medical Screening Program, which was established to identify and characterize possible World Trade Center-related health effects in responders, found that about 28% of those tested showed signs of abnormal lung function, and 61% of those who had no prior health problems developed respiratory symptoms. However, it is important to remember that debris components other than asbestos may have contributed to these symptoms. The health of these workers and people who lived or attended schools near the World Trade Center towers will need to be monitored to determine the long-term medical consequences of their exposure. Although experts agree that health risks from asbestos are greater when the exposure is heavier and of longer duration, investigators have found asbestos-related diseases in individuals with only brief exposures. Heavy asbestos exposure peaked during the 1960s and 1970s in Western, industrialized nations as declined worker safety rules were instituted and later as the industrial use of asbestos decreased. But because many of those who develop asbestos-related diseases show signs of illness a long time after their first exposure, sometimes as much as 40 years later, even now workers exposed to asbestos in the 1960s and 1970s are manifesting asbestos-associated diseases. Estimates have been made of the numbers of cancers that are projected to result from past exposures to asbestos in a number of occupations and industries. From 1940 through 1979, it is estimated that 27.5 million people had potential asbestos exposure at work. Of these, 18.8 million had exposure in excess of that equivalent to 2 months' employment in primary manufacturing or as an insulation installer. In 1982, the number of deaths attributable to asbestos-related cancer was estimated at 8,200 deaths annually. According to the Environmental Working Group, total deaths related to asbestos between 1979 and the year 2000 was about 230,000. Thank you for watching. This video was produced by Asbestos.Net, a leading resource on all aspects of asbestos and mesothelioma. Our priority is to inform victims about the devastating effects of asbestos exposure, mesothelioma, asbestos cancer, asbestosis, and other asbestos-related diseases, and to advise them with a wealth of information. Individuals whose lives have been touched by mesothelioma have numerous questions and concerns. Their caregivers and family members also need accurate, reliable information. If you or a loved one have been diagnosed with mesothelioma or asbestos cancer and need more information, we invite you to visit and explore the thousands of pages of oncologist-reviewed material on Asbestos.net, to call our convenient toll-free number shown below and speak with a mesothelioma specialist, or to use the simple contact form found at Asbestos.net to request a free copy of our informative books, custom inserts, and DVD. Asbestos.net. Information and help for patients and families.